I'm going to talk about the bones of the facial skeleton, and so these bones will make up the face, what your face looks like, also serve as attachment sites for muscles involved in chewing and facial expression. First one I'm going to mention is the major bone of the facial skeleton through which all other bones are going to attach, and it's this light blue bone. There's actually two, so these are the Maxilla bones. Maxilla for singular, maxillae for plural. So these are the maxillary bones. So there's actually two, but they fuse together through development. Okay, and here I'll show you on this one. It's the maxilla. Okay, and then they fuse together. This actually, so the maxilla contains these alveolar processes through which the teeth will be embedded. And so you see the teeth on the upper jaw. So the maxillary bones help form the anterior roof of the hard palate. So if I flip this over, all this light blue, this is the hard, if you put your tongue against the roof of your mouth, that's the hard palate that you're feeling, hard because it's made up of bone. This is all maxillary bones, the anterior portion of the hard palate. Okay. Also helps form the floor of the orbital cavity. So you'll see light blue here and here. Also, you'll see light blue on the floor of the nasal cavity. So the anterior portion of the hard palate, the floor of the orbital cavities, and the floor of the nasal cavities, all maxillary bones. Let's see, the only specific structure you have to be able to identify, if you're looking at the maxillary bones, you'll see these holes. These holes are called the infraorbital foramen. And so infra, below, orbital, and then it's a hole. So infraorbital foramen, which serves as a passageway for blood vessels. Okay, so this is the infraorbital foramen of the maxillary bones. Palatine bones, so I'll show you first on the colored skeleton. If you look, it's this these brown bones, so there are two, just like there are two of the maxillary bones. This is the Palantine bones, and they form the posterior portion of the hard palate. So, and you see that they extend down here too. So these are the Palantine bones, and I'll show you on this skeleton. Right, so it's outlined in this yellow line. This posterior portion, these are Palantine bones. Okay. Next are the Zygomatic bones. In this skeleton, they are orange. Okay. Zygomatic bones. Over here. The zygomatic bones, this is, there's one on each side. It's like your cheekbone, right? And I've already mentioned this in the other video talking about the bones of the cranium. So zygomatic bone makes up the cheek. Zygon actually means yoke-shaped, and if you Google what a yoke is, Y-O-K-E, it's a cross piece that connects like two cattle together, that you can connect a plow or some sort of trailer to, and you can see that the zygomatic bone helps make a cross piece, right? That zygomatic arch. So this portion that comes off and extends posteriorly from the zygomatic bone, this is the temporal process of the zygomatic bone, and it connects to the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Okay, and together they make up the zygomatic arch, and it's the same on this side as well. So this would be the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. Okay. Next is the lacrimal bone. Show you first on the colored skeleton. It's the yellow bone right here, and it's sandwiched in between the white bone, which is the ethmoid, and the light blue bone, which is the maxilla. Okay, so here's the lacrimal bone. On this side, lacrimal bone. Okay, the lacrimal bones, they help form the medial wall of the orbital cavity. I'll show you on here. This bone, numbered 14, this would be the lacrimal bone. And there's actually a little hole, okay, right near the lacrimal bone. So lacrimal, you think like lacrimal gland, it produces tears, and that hole actually allows for tears to pass through into the nasal cavity. So where you see that hole, this is the lacrimal bone. And then on this side, lacrimal bone. Okay. Next, the nasal bones. I'll show you on the colored skull. The brown bones right here, there are two, one on each side. They're very cylindrical or long, somewhat rectangular shape. These two bones help make up the bridge of your nose. Show you on this one. These are the nasal bones. Okay, and the nasal bones serve as the attachment site for the cartilages of your external nose. So the structure of your nose, all that cartilage and skin is attached to this muscle, or to this bone right here, the nasal bones. Okay, sorry about that. Next, the inferior nasal concha. I'll show you in this one. So we have to look into the nasal cavity, and it's these pink bones at the bottom on the lateral sides. These are the inferior nasal concha. Okay, show you on here. So again, these are the inferior nasal concha. They're on the lateral sides, and they're the scroll-like bones. Not to be confused with these upper ones, which are the middle nasal concha. And the middle nasal concha are of the ethmoid bone. Okay? The inferior nasal concha are completely separate bones. They're independent bones, one on each side. But they have the same function as the middle nasal concha, which is to increase the surface area of the nasal mucosa that lines the nasal cavity, as well as support the nasal mucosa. Okay? So the nasal mucosa is going to have all of those olfactory neurons that are going to help with our sense of smell, increase surface area, increase the number of neurons that we have. Nasal mucosa also helps warm and filter the air coming in that we're breathing. Again, more surface area, more warming, more filtering. So that's the function. So these are the inferior nasal concha. The vomer, okay, I'm going to show you here first, and it's actually would be anchored to the bottom. It's the bone in yellow, okay? If you look at it like on okay, so this yellow bone, this is the vomer. Vomer literally means plow shape. So if you Google what a plowshare looks like, it looks like this bone, okay? So this bottom portion of the nasal septum, which remember from the last video, the nasal septum separates the nasal cavity into right and left halves, also increasing surface area of the nasal mucosa that can line the cavity. This vomer is it's a separate bone, and it forms the bottom portion of the nasal septum. Remember, the top portion of the nasal septum is made of the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. So the vomer is the bottom bone, okay? And it helps create the nasal septum. Last is the mandible, which this is the mandible. You think of it as like your lower jaw. The maxilla is like the upper jaw. Mandible, lower jaw. You can also see that it contains alveolar processes through which teeth will be embedded. So this is the mandible, and this is the only bone of the skull that's movable, okay? Completely movable for chewing, all right? And so with the mandible, the first thing I'm going to point out is if you can see this posterior portion that comes up, there's two major processes or regions that come off. This back part, and it has a more smooth, it's more of a smooth process. These are the mandibular condyles. Okay, so these are the mandibular condyles. And anterior to that, these are the coronoid processes. So this is the coronoid process, mandibular condyles. Okay? Now, the mandibular condyles will articulate with the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone. So right here, this concave region, this is the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone, which I did not mention in the last video, but you need to know. This is the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone, okay? And the mandibular condyles articulate with it. So they sit right in there. And then it creates a modified hinge, which allows for chewing, okay? So, mandibular fossa of the temporal bone articulate with the mandibular condyles of the mandible, okay? And then the coronoid processes, these are, this serves as attachment sites for muscles involved in chewing. And then the last structure are these holes right here, and these are called the mental foramen. This is a mental foramen, and remember anatomical terminology, the chin is referred to as the mental region, so this is the mental foramen. And this is where blood vessels and nerves will travel through that supply the lower teeth, okay? And that's it for the facial skeleton.